Ghosts, UFOs, and cryptid creatures. Discussing all topics of the unexplained and the supernatural. You're listening to the Paranormal Detectives Podcast. Join us in seeking the truth.
Good evening and welcome to the Paranormal Detectives Podcast, a podcast where we look to discuss all kinds of subjects that are paranormal and unexplained. So far, we have recently released podcasts on the black-eyed children of Cannock Chase and of the haunting of the ancient Ram Inn. For anyone that hasn't already listened to those podcasts, please do go check them out at the end of this podcast. It would be great to hear your comments and your thoughts and opinions. In today's episode, we'll be discussing one of the most well-known, if not the most well-known story of a haunted house in the UK. Today, we discuss the story of the Enfield Poltergeist. Now, Nathan, a while ago, you actually made a video detailing all the sorts of story about the Enfield Poltergeist. So I think it's only right that you start this one off and just give us a little bit of a description about the Enfield haunting.
Yeah, I think that was the world's most famous haunting video, I believe. So the Enfield Poltergeist, as it's well known, in a simple council house located in Green Street, Enfield, London, between 1977 and 1979, a single mother named Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children reported a series of bizarre incidents that happened in their home. More than 30 eyewitness accounts later backed them up, describing items that flew through the air, matches that spontaneously burst into flames, and the voice of an old man that spoke through one of the Hodgson's young daughters. Over time, some have come to see the Enfield Poltergeist as concrete evidence of the paranormal, but others think the entire haunting was orchestrated by the family who lived in the home. According to Peggy Hodgson, the haunting of her home at number 284 began in August 1977. Peggy, who lived there with her 4 children, Margaret, aged 12, Janet, aged 11, Johnny, aged 10, and Billy, aged 7, claimed that she first knew something was up after there was a crash upstairs. When Peggy went to investigate, she found Margaret and Janet cowering in the corner of the bedroom. They told their mom the chest of drawers was moving towards the bedroom door. Peggy Hodgson told them not to be so silly, but the chest then slid across the room. Peggy couldn't believe it. She claims to have pushed the chest back twice, and on the 3rd time couldn't move it. As a strange knocking seemed to spread throughout the house, Peggy went to get help. She first reached out to a neighbour called Vic Nottingham, then to the police, and finally the media. Even the Society for Psychical Research was contacted, all of whom witnessed the strange experiences inside the house. And with that, the Enfield haunting had just begun. As time went on, the strange events at 284 Green Street seemed to escalate. Graham Morris, a Daily Mirror photographer who visited the house at the family's request, described it as chaos and terrifying. Eerily, the Enfield Poltergeist seemed particularly focused on 11-year-old Janet. She claims, "I was used and abused by some unknown force." She said it yanked her through the air and forced her to levitate. 2 men who knew what was happening inside the house better than anyone else was Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair. They stayed with the family night after night to ensure their safety and to learn more about the poltergeist-type hauntings. It was actually Maurice Gross that first managed to make contact with the spirit. The house started producing strange barking sounds like that of a dog. Maurice challenged the ghost by saying, "If you can bark like a dog, then surely you can talk like a human." Over the coming weeks, the voice of the poltergeist would be captured on many occasions. Eventually, it was discovered that the voice was actually unknowingly coming from the young Janet Hodgson, By 1978, the so-called Enfield haunting had attracted the attention of American paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. As depicted in the Conjuring 2 film, the Warrens came to England to investigate, though their involvement was not as expansive as it was in the film. The Warrens did study the case and conclude that it was an authentic haunting. Ed Warren later said, "Now, you couldn't record the dangerous, threatening atmosphere inside that little house, but you could film the levitations, teleportations, and dematerializations of people and objects that were happening there, not to mention the many of hundreds of hours of tape recordings made of these spirit voices speaking out loud in the rooms." In total, over 30 people claim to have experienced some kind of paranormal event during the Enfield haunting. They include reporters, police officers, lawyers, psychic researchers, and of course the Hodgson family. But not everyone was so convinced that the Enfield poltergeist was real. Some believe that Janet and her siblings faked the entire thing. To some, the Enfield haunting was nothing more than an elaborate prank. Skeptics claim that Janet made up the voice of the spirit herself, and that her mother encouraged her for attention and fame. Perhaps the most damning, investigators once caught the children bending spoons. Janet admitted to doing that, but said that she and her siblings were just trying to see if anyone could tell the difference. And Janet insists that they faked paranormal events just 2% of the time. The family's defenders also point out that Peggy Hodgson had nothing to gain from spreading the story. Checkbook journalism, as the Daily Mirror photographer Morris put it, simply didn't exist at the time. In any case, the hauntings trickled to a mysterious end in 1979. Though the family says they sometimes experienced slightly strange things after the haunting, like odd noises, nothing extreme happened in the later years. That said, their chilling experience has stuck with them to this day. Margaret said, "It stays with you every step of the way." It's just like death, really. It gets a little bit easier as time goes on, but the fear and the memories of it and what happened never leaves you. Janet, who experienced most of the haunting, dismisses the views of skeptics who say that she and her family made up the Enfield poltergeist. She says, "I don't care what they think. I know what happened, and I know it was real." So that's just a little bit of an overview there of the case. Obviously, the case did go on for a few years, so there is so many events that took place throughout the haunting. Obviously, couldn't go through everything, sadly, but that's just a little bit of an overview there. I know I pointed out specific parts of the case to you, Bri, that I wanted you to look into and just do a bit of objective analysis on, just to see, what could have caused some of the paranormal happenings and your thoughts on it. Would you care to go through them with us?
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. So I've had a look into some of the beginning of the story there, and I thought what I'll do is tell it in a little bit more detail to go a little bit further into that story and kind of give you my views there. So to begin right at the start there, as you said, it began in August of 1977. The first activity that was reported in the house was the 30th of August 1977. So about 46 years ago at this point. And what seemed like a normal night for Peggy and the two girls suddenly seemed to change when they were sent to bed that night. So both children were sent to their beds, and at the time they were feeling very uneasy and they couldn't settle. They soon then reported that their beds started to feel like they were shaking, and naturally, as you can imagine at the time, this would have scared the children quite a lot. So what they did is they reported it to their mum, Peggy. And at first, she dismissed it. She basically thought that what they were saying, typically, as you can imagine, were two young children and potentially just playing up that they didn't want to go to bed that night and they wanted to stay awake. So what they did is they basically were sent back to bed by their mum, and Peggy took the assumption that they just wanted to stay awake and they were being defiant in being sent to bed. And that was it, really. But then, as you outlined there, Peggy's mind would soon be changed. A little bit later that evening, it was approximately 9:30 at night. That's where Peggy heard the loud crashing noise coming from the children's room. And as you can imagine, again, quite shocked and quite concerned, and to be honest, quite ready to tell the children off, Peggy raced upstairs and entered the children's room. And that's where she saw the chest of drawers in the room had been moved from where it was usually positioned against a wall to further out in the room, just sort of by itself there. And at the time, the children were quite shook up at the time. Peggy, as you said, tried to push the chest of drawers back to where it was kept, only then to first-hand witness the chest of drawers sliding back out to where it was before. So she actually witnessed it sliding back out. It wasn't like this was done when her back was turned and she was back downstairs. It actually happened in front of her eyes, and obviously in front of the children's eyes as well. So I find that quite an interesting part. Defiantly, Peggy then attempted to push the chest of drawers back to the wall, and in a very confused way, obviously. But at this point, Peggy was unable to move the chest of drawers at all, as if it had suddenly gained so much weight, or she wasn't strong enough that she could push them. Or perhaps it was an unseen force actually preventing Peggy from moving the drawers. So I do find this part of the story a very interesting one. To kind of go over it, the very beginning, I would actually agree with what Peggy was probably thinking at the time, thinking that the children were just playing up. You know what children are like. They, if they're told to go to bed and they're not tired, or if they wanted to stay awake and do something, maybe watch a TV or something, then they're not going to want to go to sleep, and they don't give in that easy. So the initial stories that they were saying could have been used as an excuse to stay awake. However, with the stories of the bed shaking and basically the noise then leading up to that, I would still say that was potentially the children playing up. However, my opinion changes when it gets to the chest of drawers. Now, the first part of the chest of drawers, obviously moving by themselves when Peggy's downstairs, that could again still be the children, because as far as I'm aware, I don't have any data regarding how heavy the chest of drawers were, what was in there. Could the children move the chest of drawers by themselves? I'm probably pretty sure they could. So the chances are, from a skeptical point of view, they would have moved the chest of drawers themselves. When it gets to the point of the chest of drawers moving in front of Peggy's eyes, that's where my opinion changes, because she has pushed the chest of drawers back to the wall, only to see them move again by itself. Now, thinking logically about what could do that, unless the flooring was uneven, but that wouldn't make any sense because it would constantly be moving. So in terms of furniture moving, I'm not too sure about that one. And in terms of being unable to move the furniture back, as if it was being met with resistance, I do find that very interesting. Out of interest, what are your opinions on that particular one as well?
It's a very difficult one. I don't think that Peggy could have misinterpreted a chest of drawers moving in front of her, especially after pushing it back twice. I think it's got to be one of two things. It's got to be a genuine haunting and this genuinely happened, or this is just a tall tale that Peggy was coming out with. So yeah, I think it's got to be one or the other. I don't see it possible to imagining chest of drawers moving towards you repeatedly.
No.
That's all I can say on that, really. It's a difficult one.
Yeah, it's quite an extreme sort of thing to kind of report, really. It's not like you could, something lightweight, something small that's quite portable, that could be thrown, for example, could be more subjective and more explainable. A heavy piece of furniture that's quite big and is randomly moving, then suddenly not moving. I mean, perhaps the resistance side of things, maybe I don't know, maybe the flooring was actually uneven. For whatever reason it moved. Maybe it was on a bit of a floorboard that stopped it from moving back to where it was when she was trying. That's why she couldn't do it. Maybe with just being a little bit shook up at the time, that she wasn't quite thinking logically and maybe a little bit confused. It kind of panicked her a bit more. So I can kind of see, I mean, I still find it quite interesting, but at this point, there's not a lot to go by. But it does continue, as you say, the stories do continue. The next part of the story is quite an interesting one as well, and that's where the neighbour, Vic Nottingham, gets involved. So essentially what happens is, because of all of the things mentioned previously with the chest of drawers and everything the children were explaining and feeling at the time, Peggy was that confused and concerned, and I would say scared, that after witnessing this, combined with all of the actions of her children, she needed a bit of backup at this stage and a little bit of reassurance from somebody else. So she got on quite well with her neighbours, her next door neighbours, the Nottinghams. And being in the state that she was in, she decided to visit the neighbours for some support. So the Nottingham family were basically there to comfort her. And the husband of the family, Vic, even offered to spend some time next door with Peggy to see if he could witness any of the strange events himself. So at this stage, you could think that Peggy is quite reassured that, you know, suddenly there's a male in the house who's quite neutral, lives next door, a friendly face, somebody she's familiar with, somebody she trusts. And now he's in the house to see if he can experience anything else also. Also, Vic himself, he was quite a rational person who used a lot of logic and wasn't necessarily a believer in the paranormal. Was generally quite a skeptical person. So when he entered next door, he would hear the sound of tapping on the ceiling from upstairs. And he would also hear this along the walls of the house as well. Now, the interesting part about the tapping sound was that wherever Vic decided to go in the house, the tapping appeared to follow him. But not only follow him, it actually became louder and more violent as it went on. Now, my opinion for that would be, if it's paranormal, perhaps that was something trying to get his attention. That's what I would say, because, you know, if the longer something is happening for and the more he's not responding to it, maybe it's getting a little bit more violent to try and get his attention. However, what else could cause a tapping going around the room, going around the ceiling or walls? Perhaps it was, I mean, it does depend where they're saying here, but old houses creak. Could it have been a particular old house that had a bit of creaking? Could it have been even something scurrying around like a rat? Who knows? It could have been anything going on in the house there. The tapping itself could have been footsteps by a little animal if there's a little animal running around. But getting louder and more violent is an interesting one. As that went on, the tapping did certainly get Vic's attention as the night went on. And it got to a stage where he was totally confused by what he was witnessing, and he couldn't explain what was happening at all, or where the noises were actually coming from, and he couldn't explain why they were getting louder either. So due to the complete confusion of this entire situation, Vic would then go on to call the police to investigate these unexplained events further. So that's quite an extreme thing to do, really, is, you know, to be that sort of concerned and scared that you've actually gone to the police to report something there. So that's quite a big thing to do there. And what I find interesting about this situation, again, is that Vic wasn't someone that was easily scared. He was a very skeptical person, but he also took a logical approach. So for somebody of this nature to be so confused and, again, probably scared and concerned by the events taking place, it must show that the events happening inside the house were very unexplainable to Vic at the time and very concerning. Now, so much so that even when the police arrived, they were witness to an armchair which was appearing to move by itself. Something which they also investigated, inspected, and couldn't account for why that happened. So even the police, professional people who would be there investigating the concerns of the family, would also be unable to explain events they were informed about. and even the chair that was witnessed moving by itself in front of them. So you've got these impartial professionals that have come in to investigate the concerns of this family, and they're just as much in the dark as the family and easily as confused at this stage. A rocking chair moving by itself, that could potentially have been maybe a prank if they didn't see what was happening before. So maybe if one of the kids moved the chair and the police had only just looked at it, that would potentially explain it. However, if the chair suddenly decided to start rocking by itself and they witnessed that it was stationary beforehand, then I would find that quite an interesting one there. So love to get your thoughts on those events that happened there.
Well, to go back quickly to Vic Nottingham, something else I'd like to mention. When he was looking around the house and he was hearing these knocks and taps that were following him, Vic was actually a builder. He was a builder by trade. So he knew the sort of noises that would go on in houses. And he claims that he knew they just weren't your everyday run-of-the-mill, squeaking houses or floorboards or anything like that. So I find that interesting. And going on to the police report, this is one of my favourite bits of evidence of the actual whole Enfield case, to be honest. I know upon talking to the family about the occurrences, PC Heaps, Caroline Heaps, she witnessed a chair in the room that seemingly moved by itself. I've actually got the statement here that she come out with. She said, it came off the floor, maybe a ½ inch, I should say, and I saw it slide off to the right about 3.5 to 4 feet before it came to rest. I checked to see whether possibly or not it could have slid along the floor. I placed a marble upon the floor to see whether the marble would go in the same direction as the chair. It didn't. I checked for wires under the cushion of the chair and found no explanation at all. So yeah, firstly, I'd like to say I do absolutely love when I study the paranormal cases where professionals such as the police are involved. Just, I agree with you on that totally. To me, it shows genuine fear from the person involved to actually ring the police. And obviously you expect the police to investigate properly and give a good detailed sort of factual report. So I totally agree with you on that. And in this instance, it is hard to see any other cause for the eyewitness account of the chair moving. PC Heap, she seems to have investigated all the obvious possible causes. If I was being very sceptical, bordering on cynical, I would ask, where did the marble come from? Did PC Heaps often carry marbles around with her, or did one of the Hodgsons happen to have it to hand? It seems strange to have such a tool to check the levelness of the floor so perfectly to hand. And also, why is where the marble come from missing from the statement she gave? She didn't say, Janet handed me this, or I found this on the floor. She didn't really explain where the marble come from. I do wonder, perhaps going into a house that's obviously reportedly haunted by a poltergeist that moves things, perhaps that could have hampered her judgment. Personally, I think my personal thoughts are I believe that PC Heaps genuinely believes the chair moved itself. But once again, it's very difficult sort of to prove either way. But so the only thing that does trigger strange with me is the marble. It just seems very convenient, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does make sense. I suppose my opinion on where the marble come from just being, a house there with the children, I'm just going to assume that the marble was perhaps lying around in the house. Maybe it was one of the children's toys, because obviously marbles used to be quite popular, didn't they, back then? So perhaps it was just sort of lay around at the time, and maybe the police officer just either picked it up or perhaps was handed the marble by one of the children. My guess is she just found it and picked it up. And perhaps that's why that detail is missing from the report, maybe.
Yeah, you could be right. So I suppose we'll never know. There's another piece of evidence that I want to look at. The next form of evidence, it's the actual spirit voice that was recorded by Maurice Grouse. For weeks, he managed to get intelligent responses out of the alleged poltergeist. This started with barking, as I said, then moved on to repeating words that he said, so he'd often get him to repeat his name. The spirit further went on to explain that his name was Bill, and that he died in a chair in the living room of a brain hemorrhage. The tapes of all these recordings can actually be found on our channel. I urge anyone interested in the case to listen to them, because they are fascinating. Some people believe this is the only true spirit voice ever recorded. Others think it was merely Janet playing an elaborate prank and enjoying the attention. Looking at these recordings in a sort of totally non-biased way, I can understand both views, if I'm honest. When I first looked at the case, I found this evidence very far-fetched, especially when teamed up with the fact that the voice was proven to be coming from Janet. However, what I do like about this piece of evidence is the extent in which that Maurice Grouse went to rule out the obvious factors. That it could have just been Janet playing a prank. Various experiments were run. One included filling Janet's mouth with water and taping it shut while the voice spoke. And after making Janet spit all the water back out, to obviously see if she had gulped the water to try and speak, and every time, I think this was done multiple times, and every time Janet still had a mouth full of water and spat it all back out, which is unbelievable, really. Other tests were run as well that actually showed the voice was actually coming from Janet's larynx, and to keep the voice up as long as she had would just, some say, would actually be impossible using that technique. Skeptics would obviously turn to, Janet being able to do ventriloquism, possibly. Some even say that the initial barking that was heard around the house was perhaps her learning to throw a voice. What no one can explain is how Janet, a young girl, knew how a former owner of the house died and where he died, let alone his name, etc. He even mentions how the hemorrhage made Bill go blind. All of these facts are historically correct, and it's this part of the evidence that makes me believe, personally, that the voice really was that of the spirit of Bill. Like I said, initially I thought it was very far-fetched, but when you look into it in detail, I don't see how Janet could have been faking it. I think Maurice Grouse did a very, very good job of proving that as good as anybody could, even with modern technology, I believe. I mean, what are your thoughts on that one, Brian?
I find it very interesting, again, with the whole EVP, the EVP sessions that were recorded. Like you say, they're all on the channel, so if you guys want to have a look, we'll link it in the video as well, so please do go check those out. It's a super interesting case, and the recordings are incredible to listen to. To be honest, the actual voices and the recordings are actually one of the first paranormal sort of stories that I was made aware of when I was growing up. It was one of the first things that sort of captivated my attention with the paranormal. And the whole recordings of him and the voice saying that he died in a chair downstairs but with a hemorrhage, and it's always quite chilling to listen back to. I think the experiments that were run by Maurice there were very professional, done in a professional way, and like you said, try to rule out different aspects. So, for example, the filling her mouth with water, so you eliminate her trying to, make the voice herself, and any like fraudulence to it, basically. I think that gives it a lot more credit, to be honest. It's interesting what you say about ventriloquism as well, but I do believe that having your mouth completely full of water would, in my opinion, would prevent you from even being able to replicate anything like what was recorded. So I am actually in quite full agreement with the EVPs being potentially real, at least. And like you say, I mean, the actual stuff that she was saying is, where did she get that information from otherwise? So I do find it the most interesting aspect of the entire story, to be totally honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, it did go on for a long time as well. These EVPs weren't just a quick answer. It went on for weeks, I believe, of intelligent conversation. I just don't believe a child of 11 could carry that on as perfectly as it was, especially with all the experiments run. There is one last piece of evidence I want to have a quick look at, a quick talk about. And once again, it's probably one of the most famous pieces of evidence. It's actually a photograph or a series of photographs that whoever types in the Enfield Poltergeist or the Enfield Haunting, it's probably the first image that you will be hit with. And it's the very famous photographs of the girls supposedly being thrown out of their beds. The photographs were captured on a motion detection camera. One that the girls knew was set up in their room. The photos in question seemed to picture the girls mid-flight off their beds. Unlike the rest of the evidence I've mentioned and we've discussed, I really struggle with this one. I've spent countless hours looking over the photographs, studying them, and to me, it just looks like a child jumping off a bed. The body positioning is as so too that it looks like a child jumping off the bed. What I struggle with furthermore is, where are the rest of the photos? The photo shows them mid-air, and it doesn't show them slowly levitating off the mattress or a few inches off the mattress. There's many different positions that those photographs could have captured those girls in that would have been convincing. Lay flat on the back, levitating, or anything like that. However, to be in the jumping position, I really, really, really struggle with that. And knowing that the girls were aware that the cameras were there, and I just think perhaps they're having a little bit of fun when they should have been sleeping at bedtime, and perhaps jumping out of the bed. As you know, even today, modern motion sensors are not instant. There's a few seconds delay, particularly if you're taking a picture rather than a video. So with a motion sensor back then, I genuinely think there would have been a little bit of a delay, possibly a big enough delay for them to actually get up and jump before it went off. And I think as a kid, that would have been a brilliant game to play, actually, to jump and try and be photographed mid-air. So, yeah, I mean, I'd like to hear your opinion on that one as well. And also any final thoughts you've got on the case, because obviously it's a vast case. Like I've said before, it lasted many, many years, many, many events. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface, unfortunately.
Yeah, to be honest, I fully agree with you. I feel like we're singing off the same sheet, basically, for a lot of this. So great minds. I think with the photograph, it's hard to say because, and I think that's my overall opinion on the case as a whole, but I'll come into that. The photograph, like you say, could very well be a mid-shot photo. Where they're jumping. It kind of does look like it, but then I suppose if it was real life in midair that they were levitating, a still shot of that is going to look the same as if it's jumping. So it's going to be hard to determine for sure. And what I would usually say is that normally if things are good, like too good to be true, usually they are. So perhaps actually getting some full-on hard evidence of somebody levitating sounds too good to be true, which makes me think, is it a hoax, the photo at least? I do have strong opinions about the EVPs, and I do kind of feel that the EVPs are correct and potentially real. And they hold a lot more weight, at least, anyway. Whereas I think the photo is a lot easier to fake. So that's my opinion regarding the photos. In terms of sort of final thoughts about the case, I mean, as I mentioned a minute ago, it was one of the first cases I ever heard when I was young, and I would say it was probably the first paranormal documentary I ever remember watching. And that story, it truly fascinated me. And to be honest, it's largely one of the reasons why I'm doing what I do now. And I'm interested in the paranormal because everything in that story is just fascinating. Again, the most particular bit being the EVPs that were caught. I find those the most fascinating. I think that's why I've always been a little bit creeped out when we've caught EVPs around locations and we know that there's nobody there to produce those noises, yet we've suddenly got some EVPs that are recorded out of nowhere. So I do find it quite an interesting one. I think that's where my fascination of the audio side of things comes from. And really, just when you think about it, it's the sound of some old man's croaky voice essentially taking over the voice box of a young and helpless girl, telling his story about what happened to him. And when he says those details about him dying in the chair in the corner of the room, it's just quite chilling. It's enough to, make your hair stand up. And you think with how normal the story sounds as well. I mean, you have a normal woman with two normal daughters living their normal lives in a house that has no previous strange activity. Then all of a sudden you have small and large objects being moved and thrown by an unseen force. And not just by the family, but actually by neighbours, professionals, and even the press. For them to all see and witness this sort of phenomena out of nowhere, I just find it really interesting. Of course, a lot of people will say because it did come out of nowhere that it was fraudulent. But who can really say? With the amount of activity that was witnessed by the family and all these other people, they either had a very genuine poltergeist in the house, or they were very good at creating a hoax that captivated the world. And I believe that the house is these days privately owned, or at least obviously they have fresh new tenants in at this stage. And to my knowledge, reported activity has completely come to a stop. So I find that very interesting too, as if it literally seemed to come out of nowhere and then disappear into nothing. The EVP recordings are, again, the most interesting thing that I find. And if you were to 100% prove them to be 100% real, then essentially this would be amazing evidence of the afterlife, as you're literally having a conversation with somebody that died in a chair downstairs. And hearing those EVPs, they'll always give me chills, even to this day. So do I think... Well, I'm going to pass it back to you before I give you my overall opinion on what I think, whether it's fake or real. But what do you think?
I think for me, I've studied a lot of poltergeist cases. And it's almost like they're sort of reading off a script, and everything that happened within the Enfield haunting, or with the Enfield poltergeist, I should say, is your typical poltergeist activity, step by step. Now, I know when Maurice Grouse introduced the family to the word poltergeist, the family didn't even know what it meant, which I suppose going back in those days before the internet, etc., it probably would have been quite an unknown thing. But it really does follow your typical poltergeist case, but almost a poltergeist case on steroids. It seems to sort of, whereas most poltergeist cases sort of last a couple of months and then die down, this seemed to last a couple of years before dying down. Perhaps due to the energy of all the children in the house, the age. I don't know, but it does follow your typical poltergeist rulebook, which I find very interesting, because if the girls and Peggy was to try and recreate a haunting or to try and cause a hoax, I don't know as if they would know that much about poltergeists or exactly what to be doing, if that makes sense, to mirror it so perfectly. Onto the voice, like you said, I mean, personally, following the tests that were performed, I struggle to see any other cause for the voice. I find that very difficult piece of evidence to ignore, really. However, I do also definitely think the girls played tricks. I've heard stories where Maurice Grouse left his tape recorder kicking around, and they've picked things up and says, "Oh, let's move this here," and he's actually caught girls saying that on the tape recording. But once again, he's been open and honest about that and showed those recordings. He hasn't tried to brush that under the carpet like that never happened. None of them have. They've all admitted that on some instances the kids did play up to it. Which, once again, I think it's you could take that one of two ways. You could turn around and say, well, yeah, they were faking it, or, well, hang on, they've been quite open and honest about this. They're kids. Kids will be kids. So yeah, I mean, it's such a broad case. There's so many goings on. I mean, there's a story of the lollipop lady who actually saw Janet floating in the window upstairs. Now, she wouldn't have known about what was going on in the house, and she looked up and just saw Janet floating above the window, sort of thing, on the inside of her bedroom. I mean, that's another great piece of evidence that we haven't reviewed. Obviously, eyewitness accounts can be not the most reliable of all types of evidence. However, she wasn't in the house. She wasn't under stress or fear. She was just doing her job as a lollipop lady, which, once again gives it a little bit more credibility for me. So I'll give you my final thoughts. I genuinely think that it was a real poltergeist case. I think there's too much evidence to prove that for it not to be. I think with over 30 eyewitness accounts, including lawyers, police, professionals, and investigators, I don't think that much evidence could have all been faked. So I do think it was a genuine poltergeist case. However, I do think it actually got a little bit silly at times. I think there was times, obviously, the voice went on and all that things happened. And then, like I said, they were checking Janet, whether she had telekinesis and stuff like that. And, she was actually bending spoons. And I think a lot of things also went on with the girls just playing up. But ultimately, they didn't come out of it with anything. There was no financial benefit for this claim. There was no sort of financial gain for them whatsoever. Ever since the case, the house has never been opened up to the public for investigations or anything like that. It's never been a paid location like we have so many of today. There's no one really gaining from it, which in itself, to me, makes it very genuine. Obviously, I'm not going to go off on too much of a rant, but the amount of supposed haunted locations that pop up this day and age, which you find out used to be a bloody laundrette or a sweet shop, and then people just lie about the history and just try and make money, basically, in many, many cases. This has nothing to do with that. There's no financial gain whatsoever. So my opinion is, yes, there was a poltergeist case. Yes, I do believe it was the spirit of Bill, but I do think it was exaggerated by a lot of the girls' tricks that they performed. So yeah, what's your opinion?
I think that's a good analysis, to be honest. And my opinion, to be honest, it's kind of gone through a bit of a journey, and it kind of differs a little bit here and there. So I'm going to try and explain it the best I can here, but my opinion was always that the story was a real haunting. Unless there was any concrete evidence that fakery had happened, then it was always a hard one to comment on, especially if we weren't personally there to live through it and experience it ourselves. or if there isn't any solid evidence under controlled conditions. So, for example, when you've got a locked off camera and these items have been thrown and you've caught it on a camera, and you've got the full room in view there. Obviously, without that sort of evidence, everything becomes questionable, is what I'm trying to say. The most impressive piece, again, of evidence I would say would be the EVP recordings and everything that came out of there. I think the tape recordings are phenomenal to listen to. But everything else, as I've kind of got a little bit older, I do kind of think that, perhaps this could be real. However, this could also be faked as well. And like I say, without being there ourselves and witnessing it ourselves, it's hard to say, isn't it? So I think for so much to be witnessed, though, by so many people, I think that builds credibility to the case. However, on the other hand, the more a story develops and the more rumours start circulating about a house on Green Street that has all this paranormal activity happening, the place starts getting a bit of a local reputation. And perhaps those people that get invited there to go and have a look, perhaps that can actually play into people's minds a little bit. And perhaps they actually start believing that they're witnessing something paranormal when in actual fact it's explainable. So I'm going to go back here to, as an example, something like the rocking chair moving. Perhaps that was completely moving by itself from start to finish, and the police witnessed it and everyone else witnessed it, that from, going from a stationary position to rocking back and forwards. However, again, without any solid evidence of that, without a full-on video recording of that happening, and perhaps with the certain police officer at the time maybe just catching a glimpse of it in the corner of her eye, perhaps one of the children did set it off, and because she's noticed it, it's made her think, I'm here in a haunted house, or I'm here in a house with lots of strange, unexplained things going on, and suddenly I've just seen a chair moving. Perhaps if it is a hoax, the children would have denied touching the chair, and that would have also fed into the mind and the fear that gets created and everything that gets created there in the head. So that's just obviously one example. Everything else, another one you could use there is about you mentioned the lollipop lady outside. Although she wasn't sort of in on it as such, and she wasn't somebody that had visited the house herself, she was outside. She did look up at the window and she did see Janet in the window levitating. Perhaps Janet was just jumping, and maybe word had got round on the estate out there. Maybe the lollipop lady was aware and she just caught a quick glimpse of Janet in the air, and maybe that's all it took. Maybe that was just enough for her imagination to run away with it and take it as, I've just seen something really unexplained. Obviously, if it was a jump, the next time she would have looked, Janet wouldn't have been in the window. So again, if she turned around and said that she was staring at her and it was 10 seconds or so that she was levitating there for, and perhaps again, if there was video or photographic proof to back it up, then that would be something to question more. But without that sort of evidence, I think it becomes more hearsay and what people believe and what people think they've seen, potentially. So again, it is hard to comment without having the experiences ourselves or be presented with solid, undeniable evidence. And to be honest, taking it away from Green Street here, myself personally, I've experienced weird and unusual things in my own home over the course of the years that I've lived here. And they're on random occasions. There doesn't appear to be any pattern to the frequency of events that happen. And if anything actually triggers it, it just happens. And I know that when those events have happened, they've left me totally at a loss for a reasonable explanation. And I've experienced those things. So just like how this haunting seemingly came out of nowhere, doesn't mean it also isn't real. It is a difficult one to comment on. But because of the evidence available, the number one piece of evidence for me would be the recordings, because I find that very hard to fake. And like you say, the ones where the girls' voices have been captured, where they've been playing a prank or up to no good, that's actually been shared. So it's quite transparent in that sense. But because of the rest of the evidence that is essentially missing, and by taking a critical look at that, I would actually slightly side on towards the majority either being a hoax, or perhaps a lot of it is actually explainable. So either a hoax of the girls and the family were in on it, or potentially stuff that was explainable but perhaps got a little bit out of control with how it was being perceived, would be my sort of general feeling now. Again, the voice recordings, I can't really give you an answer for. But everything else, potentially you could find something for. I think the only other one maybe that I'd struggle with might actually be the furniture at the very beginning that we mentioned about the chest of drawers moving, because I do find that a bit unusual. But like we said, it could have just purely got caught on a bit of carpet, maybe a floorboard. There could always be a reason for everything. So without being there and experiencing it ourselves, it's hard to say.
I agree. A lot of the evidence could be explained away. But yeah, I think just for me, the sheer amount of different people, all of which who had nothing to gain from their experiences, giving testimony to that things happened in the house and they witnessed this and witnessed that. If it was just a family who witnessed these things and people went in and nothing really happened for the people that went in, etc., I would say, potentially it's just a hoax by the family. But the amount of various people that went in, people that the family never knew, they had no connection with, other than possibly Vic Nottingham, the rest of them they had no real connection with. And I just think there's too many eyewitness accounts for it not to be genuine. I think it gets to the point, how many people do you disbelieve, or how many people do you believe are being tricked? For me, it just rings true, a very true poltergeist haunting, just a very, very energetic one, so to speak. Just a very powerful poltergeist haunting. Possibly the most powerful there has been or will be again.
I think I have to agree. It's definitely an intriguing story. And again, I don't think we'll ever truly know the answer to whether it was real, whether it was a hoax. I think the only people that will ever truly know are the people that were involved. And obviously they swear blind that it was a true haunting. So I suppose this would now conclude the podcast, though, for the Enfield Poltergeist. So just want to thank you all for listening. What we'd like to know is that, do you believe in the story of the Enfield Poltergeist? You've heard our opinions, so now we want to hear yours. Please do drop us a comment below and let us know your thoughts. We'd absolutely love to hear them. So I think on the next podcast, what I think we'll do next time is we'll look at a story that's a little bit out there and was a world famous story. Next time, I think we'll discuss the alien abduction story of Betty and Barney Hill. What do you reckon?
Yeah, that sounds like a good one. I don't actually know much about that case at all. I've obviously heard of it. I know it's a very, very famous case. But you tend to do a lot more research into UFO sightings, abductions and stuff like that than me. So I suppose it's a bit of a role reversal, really, this next time. You'll be taking me on a journey. I look forward to looking into it and seeing what I can learn.
I look forward to doing that one. And to be honest, if there's any other topics in particular that you want us to cover, please do let us know in the comments below. Absolutely anything we can look to cover, or any story in particular. So do let us know if there's anything there. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please go check out our others and our full investigations on our channel as well. Please do remember to like, share and subscribe, as this really helps us out.
And until next time, keep seeking the truth.